Today, are we in the midst of a cash long con? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Well, notice post covering finance and property news. Last Tuesday, in my live show, I discussed the current Treasury paper on mandating cash acceptance in Australia. But today, I want to take this further, and I'll be outlining my concern that the government may well be playing a long con with the community ahead of the upcoming election. The paper says that cash acceptance refers to the practice of businesses accepting cash as a form of payment for goods and services. Cash acceptance levels must remain sufficient to enable consumers, including those unable to use digital payment methods, to participate in the economy. A cash acceptance mandate aims to guarantee cash remains a viable and accessible in-person payment option for essential items. Successful implementation of a mandate requires collaboration and will ensure the benefits of continued growth in the use of digital payments do not leave parts of the community behind and weaken payment systems' resilience. So it propagates the myth that cash as a method to pay for goods and services has declined substantially in recent years. They say Australians are increasingly preferring to use card or digital payments to pay for goods and services, and it refers to the RBA survey from 2022, which found that 13% of transactions were conducted using cash, with electronic payments making up the other 87%. However, high cash users, that is, those who use cash for 80% or more of their in-person transactions, now include around 1.5 million people, as at the 30th of June 2024, or approximately 7% of adult Australians. Accordingly, they say, while electronic payments are growing in popularity, it's clear some Australians retain a strong preference or need to use cash, and that cash serves an important role for many Australians. Reduced levels of cash acceptance, they say, could have significant impacts on the community, particularly those who rely heavily on cash transactions. These impacts are not felt uniformly across society, they say. Regional and remote areas can be more reliant on cash as a payment method. This may be because disruption in regional areas, such as through digital outages or natural disasters, may have a more significant impact than in metropolitan areas. Older Australians, they say, may be disproportionately impacted by reduced cash acceptance, given their long-standing familiarity and trust in the cash system. And many individuals prefer to use cash due to its simplicity and the sense of control it provides over their finances. Transition to digital payments may be daunting, leading to a sense of exclusion and frustration. And low-income households, younger Australians, and individuals without access to credit cards can rely more on cash for daily transactions and as a means of household budgeting. For those groups, cash can be a tangible way to manage their finances, helping them to avoid overspending. Cash transactions can provide individuals with more confidence that they can maintain their privacy and safety and avoid or reduce the risk of fraud, identity theft, or digital abuse, which can be associated with electronic payments. Anonymity of cash transactions means that personal information is not shared, reducing the risk of data breaches and financial fraud. However, falling cash transactions actually is a myth because overall volume of transactions have risen fast. So the actual volume of cash transactions is holding steady or indeed rising. And more recent RBA data shows a rise in cash transactions, with perhaps up to 40% of people using cash sometimes. Cash transactions, of course, cannot be traced, and there is no data collection to be monetized. And of course, cash is legal tender. Now, as a reminder, the Treasury report is a fragmented response following the recent regional banking inquiry, which reported months ago, and having heard evidence from regional areas across the country, recommended that cash availability should be preserved as a matter of urgency, despite the spate of bank branch closures and ATM removals. This is clearly a hot potato which cannot be politically swept under the carpet. The surprising fact, as I've discussed recently, is that cash transactions are holding firm despite all the hurdles to getting and using cash. This is explained by a number of reasons. For example, cash being the only means of transacting in an outage due to technical issues like bank systems going down, or external events like fires or floods, of which we've seen many recently. The RBA data shows that Australia's retail payment system has an average availability of at least 99.8% each quarter. Data showing average service availabilities, total seating ounces, and total durations between the September quarter of 21 to March 24 shows that whilst there is a high level of availability, when outages do occur, they can be highly consequential for people, the Treasury says. During the 2022 floods that impacted northern New South Wales, nearly 70,000 essential energy customers were affected by power outages, and during the peak of the floods, 18 communities across northern New South Wales had no telecommunications access through mobile, landline, or internet. Telecommunication companies said that the scale of the outages was due to power loss, flood damage to land-based infrastructure like fibre optic cables, and sites like mobile base stations being inaccessible. Another reason cash is in use is the rise of extra charges for paying with debit or credit cards or devices, thanks to surcharging, as I discussed in my recent show titled Households Could Save $1 billion or More. The few extra cents on that coffee adds up to the benefit of the banks. In fact, some small businesses are now preferring cash and offering a discount for this form of payment, despite the costs to them of handling, potentially banking the cash received. Banks, of course, charge SMEs for cash deposits and withdrawals. And there is a really interesting trend of households using cash as a means of budgeting, splitting up their money into different piles and allocating funds to each. This is an effective means of managing money. And while it may sound steam-powered, in fact, it also teaches the real value of money and avoids the risk of uncontrolled credit to the annoyance of the banks. Kids in particular, please note. The Treasury says for some lower income households, cash remains an important part of how they budget and purchase goods, and the cash acceptance mandate would assist in preserving this approach. So Australia is now following an interesting trend of wanting to ensure cash is available and accessible, alongside several Scandinavian countries, the UK, and even New York. In June 2023, the European Commission put forward a proposal to ensure widespread acceptance of cash payments, as well as sufficient and effective access to cash. And recall that Adrian Orr, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, called out the need for cash and linked it directly to ensuring a stable society and even democracy itself. In the US, the approach to cash acceptance mandates is a bit fragmented. While there is no federal mandate, several states, including Colorado, Illinois, Montana, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York, have all introduced localized mandates requiring businesses to accept cash for payments below a certain value. But now this takes us to the rub. A Treasury document. First, they say the cash mandate is to apply to only essential services, and small business below an annual turnover of $10 million are exempt. Now we need to ask why. Why not make it universal? So we get into the complexity of trying to define what an essential good or service might be. They say there is no universally applied definition of an essential good and service in Australian Commonwealth, state or territory law. Governments are sought to identify essential services for a range of specific purposes. Now remember that banks, through COVID, argued that their branches were essential services, but since then they have closed them en masse, claiming, well, they're not perhaps after all. The mandate is proposed to apply to corporations applying essential goods or services, that is, goods or services that are purchased by consumers to meet absolute basic needs, are critical to maintaining day-to-day living arrangements, or are compulsory. In applying this definition, the focus is on the typical circumstances for consumers. While some goods or services may be essential for a minority, the mandate is focused on cash acceptance for goods and services needed by most consumers, they say. Goods or services are required to meet absolute basic need if there is no reasonable substitute that can meet that need. Where goods or services can be substituted to meet absolute basic needs, they're not essential. For example, restaurant meals are not essential, as the need for food can be met through a home-cooked meal prepared with food from a supermarket. Goods or services that are critical to maintaining day-to-day living arrangements are those without which a person's circumstances may be altered in a fundamental way. For example, the housing would become uninhabitable, or the person would be unable to maintain employment. Goods or services that are compulsory are those required by law. For example, compulsory third-party insurance required when a motor vehicle is registered. And the SME exemptions means that the bulk of small outlets, like newsagents and a raft of smaller food shops, would be excluded. It's proposed to treat businesses that are part of a franchise arrangement separately to increase certainty for consumers. If franchise arrangements were not dealt with separately, then two different businesses within the same franchise or brand that are more likely to be subject to different treatments under the cash acceptance mandate, which would cause confusion for consumers. However, as the relationship between franchisors and franchisees differs significantly across industries, including in relation to cash handling practices, stakeholder views are being sought on how the mandate and the exemptions to the mandate may best be calibrated to respond to the business needs of franchisees, which, but for the franchise arrangement, would otherwise be regarded as small businesses. But the third factor is whether businesses should only be required to accept cash for transactions below a certain dollar limit, or be required to accept cash in person payments only during certain hours of the day, for example, from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., or a combination of the elements of the two previous, requiring businesses to accept cash for in-person payments only during certain hours of the day and for transactions below a specific dollar limit. This dual approach aims to maximize flexibility for businesses while still ensuring that cash remains an accessible payment option for consumers. Under all three options, they say businesses can still choose to accept cash outside of the dollar and/or time limits. They're just not required to. And they also discuss the cash distribution and access elements of access to cash, saying the effectiveness of a cash acceptance mandate will also be dependent on the ability of businesses to withdraw cash for a float and deposit takings, and the ability of consumers to withdraw cash from an ATM or a branch or bank at post outlets. Now, they're proposing a timeline with potential legislation allowing commencement in January 2026. So, standing back, it seems to me Treasury is making a simple objective deliberately complicated, ring-fencing many small businesses and services to the point that cash accessibility might in fact still not be effectively enabled. Dale Webster over at the Regional says, does anyone realize that Albo is proposing a mandate to allow newsagents to refuse to take cash for a newspaper? This is just the tip of the iceberg. How to stuff up a perfectly good Senate inquiry recommendation to guarantee all Australians the right to pay in cash. To help, I'm running a question in my SME surveys to see whether small businesses would be minded to take cash, perhaps to support a wider mandate. I'll make a submission to the Treasury when the data is back. But my suspicion is this is more about being political than anything else. The government knows that cash availability is a really big issue and it can't be avoided. So this Treasury paper allows the issue to flow on beyond the next election. Meantime, the neoliberals in the pockets of the big banks still want to take our right to use cash away. So on one hand, they can appear to be taking the right of cash seriously, but continue to assure the banks that they support them. It's a classic yes, minister, long con. Now, we can break that by making sure we provide responses to Treasury along the lines of, first, there should be no carve-out just for essential services, which is difficult to try to define, and also that all businesses should still be required to accept legal tender in the form of cash. That's a really simple antidote to the long con. And submissions need to be in by the 14th of February 2025. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.